World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Robert Ricigliano, Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM, with a year-end edition of our World Affairs Roundup. As the Obama administration takes shape, our Roundup regulars are here to examine how worldviews, personalities, and the realities of Washington policymaking will impact American foreign policy for the next 4 years. The panel will also provide an update on some of this year's stories likely to remain in the Oval Office inbox until the new occupant arrives in January, including Fatah accompli. Pakistan's federally administered tribal areas, or Fatah, have become the epicenter of a widening circle of political violence stretching from Afghanistan to Mumbai and beyond. How should the U.S. address what has become a sanctuary for global terror? African anguish, armed conflict, genocide, and criminally bad governance dominate headlines from the continent. How will the new administration redefine the American role in places like Sudan, Somalia, Zimbabwe, and Congo? Brother, can you spare yuan? With iconic American corporations teetering, the global economic order looks set for significant change. Will the U.S. remain at the head of the table? And which players will have a seat? Ready to put down their eggnog and take up these issues are John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Director of Program for Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back. And for taking on what I'm sure is going to be a difficult show to pack into 30 minutes.
We'll have to decide after if we're regulars or irregulars.
Yeah, well, that's up to the audience to decide, I suppose. So I wanted to make an analogy for our first issue to what Nobel award-winning economist Paul Krugman has advocated for on the domestic policy side, economic policy side, which is the new administration should think bold and act boldly. When they've got a plan, triple it. How should the administration, or how do you think the administration is going to attack foreign policy, where they have very, very big issues, international image, issues like global warming and energy? How is this the time for bold action? Now, John, I'll start with you. Are we going to see bold action from this administration, or are we going to see kind of cautious incrementalism?
Well, it's a long time to January. But if you look at the team that the president-elect has assembled, you find in the most realists who are more cautious in terms of dealing with foreign affairs. In a way, it almost seems as though the president-elect is clearing that issue or putting that issue off to the side, not to encumber him as he begins to look at some of these domestic issues.
And how do you see it? Will they push on foreign policy just as they may push on the economic side?
I think in some areas they will, because there's so much pressure. For example, on global warming, I think that they will. There's this deadline coming up. They're meeting in Poland right now on a new lead up to a new treaty to replace Kyoto, and there are deadlines in next December. And I know that everybody in Poland has been just sitting there waiting, wondering what the administration is going to do. I think that there's a lot of will to actually dramatically change our policy there. We're inheriting a number of issues that we can't just decide that we're going to put on the back burner. I mean, we just with the terrorist attack in Mumbai. I mean, you need to be making decisions. Maybe they won't necessarily be bold departures, but foreign policy is something that usually can't be put on the back burner because there are always lots of surprises.
Robert, if I push you more toward not what the administration is likely to do, but what you think they should do, what would you have them be? What tone would you have them set?
Hopefully those coincide, but who knows? I would say the economic crisis is the cloud over everything. And it's getting worse by the day. The job numbers, we go back from 1974 now to we're going back to the 30s for the worst job numbers ever reported, and so that's going to be a huge focus. And President Obama wants the Congress to be ready to give him things to sign when he's inaugurated, and that may not be possible. But that's going to, I think, push back any bold departures on international affairs. And in fact, the team he's assembled seems to suggest an incremental transition to something that ultimately becomes bolder. So if you look at Iraq, you have a 16-month timeline, which he's fudged a little bit. And so that's not an immediate withdrawal, but economically you may need to be able to not have to keep paying for the war. So when the economic tie-ins come in, there's more pressure. Probably the most, I think Ann's absolutely right about global warming, and that's something they have to be ready on in the winter. But the other thing is that I think there's a strong belief that what's happening in South Asia can't wait necessarily, and that they need to be bolder there, particularly based on what their analysis is, since a lot of quote-unquote realists have been put in, what their analysis of the situation is. If they can push things off, they will. But I think Ann's right and John's right. If there's an immediate crisis that they sense, they're going to act more proactively. But the economic crisis overshadows everything. And the other thing, he's going to take on the healthcare debate. And that's going to be a huge divisive, unfortunately, national debate as well. So this is going to be a very domestic presidency early on.
Well, let me. I want to get to South Asia and the federally administered areas in Pakistan in a minute. But John, I want to push it to you as an old Foreign Service officer, and Ann as well. Are we seeing, with the economic crisis and these tie-ins? So Iraq is connected to this, climate change, energy. All these things are connected to domestic issues. Are we seeing a less of a line between domestic and foreign policy now?
Clearly, as globalization has taken over our economy, what happens in China very much affects what's happening here. The prices, we were riding very nicely in terms of cheap prices for products. Now all of a sudden, those goods, because of the downturn here, are going back to China, and is going to have impact there. I disagree with both of them in terms of global warming. I don't see any bold initiatives in the area of global warming simply because of the economic impact. The cost to our economy to take on some of the more aggressive ideas in terms of dealing with global warming just don't seem to me to be feasible in the near term.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think there's the tie-in. We want to invest in infrastructure in order to try to get the economy going. And so we're going to invest a lot in green technology and green energy. So the tie-in between global warming and both our short-term economic crisis and what we need to do to build a long-term economy that has quality jobs, that has been coming together. There's a new consensus around that, and Obama and his new administration understand that. And so again, it's exactly what you said, Rob. It ties the foreign policy concern back into the domestic concern. They fit together much more neatly than before.
And I think that, it's right now it seems like we can't afford to do it because oil is $40 a barrel. But it's the cyclical nature of this where we have to think a little bit more long term and not always assume that it's going to be favorable.
I'm not disagreeing with that. In fact, the only thing that bothers me about what you're suggesting is the government would be doing this kind of investment as we saw under Jimmy Carter and the rise of the Department of Energy and all of those projects that just were turned up to be nothing because there wasn't an economic imperative to see it be accomplished. The infrastructure that I think that he's going to be taking on has more to do with roads and bridges than it has to do with the environmental impact. I mean, there obviously will be an environmental impact, but this is rebuilding our roads.
They'll do that. They'll find green tie-ins where they can. But cap and trade, by the way, actually raises a ton of revenue because you're taxing all of it. And so there's a way to deal with the huge historic deficits we're creating by doing a global warming cap and trade like system.
I want to put that one on hold because I know we can continue on that. We'll have to have another show on this. But I want to go back to the federally administered tribal areas we talked about at the beginning, and Robert, you referenced. Again, it's the kind of issue where some pundits were saying, once General Musharraf was off the scene in Pakistan, that then they could actually take a firm line against militants in Pakistan. And let me go to you again. Is this the time to really now push this new civilian government to take a hard line and crack down on those and take charge of those federally administered areas and the militant groups, or is it time to kind of back off and not do anything that might make their life harder?
Well, I think that ideally, if they could push the Pakistani government to take charge of those areas and ensure that, you know, they weren't a safe haven for terrorists, they would. But the problem is that they can't, and they never have been able to. So we have to deal with, you know, what's the next best solution, which I think we have to give the Democratic government a chance, work with the Democratic government. I think that, you know, keep coming back to the appointments that have been made. I think that the appointment for National Security Advisor on this issue is a really good one because General James Jones has, I think that we want to get NATO, he was the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, right, in NATO, and I think that if we do want to, not just with the U.S. response, but also in working with the Pakistan and Afghanistan together, the whole issue together, and we want NATO to be involved more, I think he's a brilliant choice for that perspective.
John, is this, as one of our resident idealist versus realist students, is this the time, as sort of Anne was indicating, this is the time for a very realistic policy vis-a-vis the Pakistani government, or is it time to push them harder?
Go back to the great game, and very nicely captured by Peter Hopkirk, who wrote the book by the same name. No one has really administered or controlled that territory. The Brits and the Russians tried. The Pakistanis apparently do. The government has very little control. It's the army and the intelligence service which has much greater influence, but only modestly so. So to say that they control this area is a pipe dream. Therefore, when we start to try to deal with the larger question of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we have to be realistic about what is possible. The democratically elected government, largely as a fixture of the cities, of the urban areas, has no influence whatsoever in these areas. So they're not going to be a vehicle for addressing these things. We have to keep many avenues open, both to the Army, to the intelligence service, and to the government to try and control this issue.
Robert, you mentioned this earlier, so what should we be doing in South Asia?
Well, we should not be bold with the idea there's a military solution, because there isn't, and that's been the problem with the previous administration. I know Obama had to campaign on that, because in terms of campaign discourse, hopefully that's not his position. I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of diplomatic things you could do that were bold. If you would try to actually resolve the India-Pakistan conflict, that would go a long way towards this, because a lot of what Pakistan's military and intelligence establishment does is relates to the India conflict. That's why they support the Taliban and other elements of the Taliban and other extremists. Then you could try bringing Iran in, quite frankly, to get some sort of solution in Afghanistan that ended the war with the Taliban and gave them some share of power. So there's probably bold diplomatic things you could do. You'd have to think out of the box and think actually about a Pakistani, Indian, and Iranian kind of axis around Afghanistan. It's possible that could be pursued. I don't know if they will or not, but that's the kind of bold diplomatic action you should do, as opposed to thinking there's a military solution to going and chasing the extremists out of the FATA.
I want to save time so we can come to you with to our two other sort of big issues of the global economy and the crises in Africa. We'll do that in just a moment on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus and our year-end edition of our World Affairs Roundup. We're with John Katzka and Ann Hamilton, Robert Kraig, our usual regulars. I wanted to take up a group of issues that we unfairly put together because they all happen to be on the same continent. And that's the various crises happening in Africa, from genocide in Sudan to the crises in Somalia, the killing in Congo, and the mess in Zimbabwe. For the last 8 years, I mean, Africa has been this kind of moral hazard. We know it's a problem, yet we've not really seemingly done a whole lot there because of higher profile conflicts, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. Is that likely to change? And maybe I'll start, John. We'll come down the road. But is this a time when we can push harder on those questions? Secretary Albright and Secretary Perry issued a report saying going after and preventing genocide now is a sort of core U.S. national interest. Is our Africa policy likely to change?
You know, it's interesting. This comes up on the 60th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which nation states have been particularly bad in addressing. And the only saving grace on the issue of those minimum human rights has been the growth of non-governmental organizations, which have brought this and used their bully pulpit to make sure that the world was aware of it. This is the issue, again, of interference in internal affairs of countries that we have been wrestling with for the last probably, I guess, Kosovo and Bosnia was the beginning of it. We saw it, we're seeing it occasionally. There is resistance within groups. The Islamic group is strongly a reason why we have not gone, the Arab League is not why we have not gone into Darfur. Similar kinds of things is why we haven't done anything about Zimbabwe. But also it is a question of where our interests are and how visible this issue becomes before it rises to the level that we have to do something.
So is it, I mean, as Albright and Perry are saying, that they want to see $250 million put into keeping crises from getting to the point that we have to do something about it?
Well, $250 million in terms of dealing with the continent of Africa is almost laughable. I think what they're doing is drawing attention to this and possibly setting this up, but the United States isn't going to be able to do this alone, and there hasn't been a consensus amongst the countries that have the ability up to this point that they're willing to step on the territorial integrity or the regional interest of the groups involved.
I see it a little bit differently. I mean, I do think Susan Rice was Obama's probably closest foreign policy advisor during the campaign, and now she's going to be the UN ambassador, and he's indicated that this will be a cabinet position now. She's been way out there talking about how upset she was by the genocide in Rwanda and is very, very interested in taking on these issues from what I've read. I think the report, you know, dovetails into that, and I think that, you know, during the Rwanda genocide, the Clinton administration would never use there are these very comical press reports where they're dancing around the word, you know, not using the word genocide because of the understanding that if they called it a genocide, they might have some legal obligations to react. And then now you had the Bush administration actually calling Sudan a genocide and then really appallingly doing nothing, because if you recognize something as a genocide, then it is incumbent upon you to do something. So I think that there's a lot of concern about this in particular circles, and I know that $250 million is laughable, but I think that although people have talked about dealing with this, I think that Obama, everybody's now saying he's a realist, but he talks about security in a very different way than most realists talk about security. He's talking about, he says, the security, when somebody's security is threatened in one corner of the world, it affects our security. It's on an individual level, and it has to do with quality of life or even just basic human needs, which is not the way realists normally look at security. So that although it's a very difficult issue to deal with, I think that there is a lot more I don't know, determination on the part of this administration to make some significant changes. I don't know how that will play itself out, though.
Well, there's been, Robert, there's been some news saying that this State Department and this security team is going to focus more on conflict prevention and aid and dealing with failing states. That would seem to say Africa is going to rise in prominence in their foreign policy. Do you expect that?
I think there's good reason for it too. We'll see what happens with the economic crisis and the other distractions for the administration. But you also have the president's personal stake in the country. His father, being a native Kenyan, right, also increases interest. And the kind of foreign policy vision we're talking about here was called post-war, Cold War internationalism after the Cold War ended. It never fully congealed or developed. There were some elements of it in the Clinton administration, but it does have, I think Ann's absolutely right, a very different view of security. It sees people poverty and economic hardship as insecurity. And that is that's a view that's been developing in foreign policy thought for a couple decades now. And so but what it's going to actually be, I mean, John's absolutely right, and Ann agrees, 250 million isn't much. He's trying to lay down a marker here for a new kind of foreign policy, and part of what he said during the campaign
This isn't his initiative.
Right, I know, but it's coming from people who are very closely identified with him, and so I see it looks fairly coordinated, but I understand what you're saying. But I think that there's a commitment to try to build a consensus. He would need the rest of the world to participate, for our allies to be involved in this. But you can't just declare, if you're not a unilateralist, you can't just declare, here is what we're going to do. You can say these are problems and try to identify and develop consensuses. That suggests not bold action right away, but it suggests a strong desire to move a different direction. Then you have the emerging importance of Africa in terms of how large a continent is, in terms of population, in terms of China's involvement in it, the resources, et cetera. I think there's a realization that Africa can't continue to be ignored, but that's easier said than done. And
well, you mentioned China, Robert, and again, I want to come back to you, John, from the realist perspective. Is there many people have tried to make the humanitarian tragedies and that expanded notion of security as a way of making Africa more of a realist concern. If that doesn't do it, does the incentive to counter China make involvement in Africa more of a realist concern, do you think?
Well, actually, we're going to talk about this in a second, and that is the economic situation in the world. China's former activities in Africa would be more likely because China's economy is right on the verge of imploding, and we're going to see. I mean, the way in which this economic crisis is playing out, as it had marched from the subprime into the financial markets, into the major manufacturers, and when the 20 nations and then the 40 nations of the world got together to come up with solutions, this is beyond control. Look at the riots that are going on in Athens right now, and they're spreading to Spain. This is an issue that we haven't even begun to see the end of what is the downturn. And how this is going to, let me rephrase that, this will have a significant impact on whatever we're going to try to do in Africa, whatever we're going to try to do in Pakistan, because there's going to be limited resources. There's going to be the domestic economy is going to rise higher in terms of its importance, and we're not going to have either the people or the resources to be able to apply to these other areas.
Well, again, we've been talking about the economy, the domestic side, as if it was somewhat divorced from the international side. So this whole issue of the international economy and whether the U.S. should be trying to restore itself as a preeminent sort of player in that, or whether you adjust to life as instead of a G7 or a G8, more like a G20, maybe a G40. Where is the U.S. better advised to go, Ann, in your opinion? Is it to be looking, not to try to put the genie back in the bottle, but actually say, hey, we got to adapt to a multipolar economic world and deal with that?
I think we have to do that in this. I mean, there's a recession going on here, and that recession, so negative growth in developed countries. There is, by most accounts, I don't know, John maybe has read something more recent, but that there will continue to be growth in China and in, well, the BRIC countries as they're called, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. I'm not so sure about Russia, given what's happened in the oil market, but I think that that's the area where there is growth. They do, it's 42% of the world's population, or it's a huge consumer market, and although they're experiencing huge troubles, they are, just by virtue of those facts, they have a lot more economic clout. And if there are going to be if there is going to be any effort to deal with the whole regulatory framework, we have to expand from the G7 or G8 idea to something that gives real power to some of these other emerging markets. I don't really think we have a choice. We can ignore it and just continue to, plummet.
Well, I mean, the events of the last few months have in many ways destroyed the legitimacy of the Washington Consensus. And you know, countries like Brazil are looking on.
Just say a bit of background about Washington Consensus.
Well, there was the United States and its allies through the IMF and the World Bank have been trying to impose a kind of a view of kind of a Chicago School of Economics view of how you should run an economy, and have used financial pressure to put a great deal of pressure on countries to do things they didn't want to do as far as how they structured their economies. And now the emperor seems to have no clothes. It turns out that the great financiers in Wall Street do not know how to run an economy, and they had and did a tremendous, the magnitude of what was done as far as the financial instruments and the irresponsibility of it and the extent to which the entire world financial establishment was part of it is shocking and outrageous, and continue to come forward. And so Lula da Silva in Brazil is rightly outraged that Brazil has been damaged by this, and so they're demanding that they are stakeholders. They have the most economic growth in the world is in the emerging economies, that they should have a say in this to protect themselves. And it's a strong argument. Whether they have the leverage to force it, I don't know. China could eventually try to call in a lot of its debt in the United States and could have substantial leverage. I don't think that's about to happen in this crisis. But I'm just saying that ultimately, if the United States and the European countries ignore this over time, they may have enough economic leverage to force it. But right now, they have a strong argument that they should have a much greater say in the structure of the global economy.
Well, I'm going to have to leave that as the last word, and thank you all for another great year of World Affairs Roundup. I know John was just had nothing he wanted to say. And let me say to our viewers, we want to thank you for watching us this year, and we look forward to watching the foreign affairs events of the next year with our panel, and we'll be here on World Affairs Roundup, International Focus, into the new year. So have a great new year, and we will see you again soon.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,